About 24 years ago, 1 megapixel cameras like this were quite normal. And now we've got cameras that boast 60 megapixels or even more, like the Leica Q3 or the Sony A7R5. But does anyone really need 60 megapixels on their camera? Or is, say, a 24 megapixel camera more than enough for most people's needs? So today I'm going to break down the different scenarios to help you figure out which camera is best for your needs, and maybe even save you some cash along the way by avoiding buying a camera that you don't need. So let's get into it. You may have noticed that cameras and mobile phones these days are constantly upgrading and increasing the number of megapixels that they have in their cameras. The current iPhone 15 has 48 megapixels, and the Leica Q3 and the Sony A7R5 both boast 60 megapixels or even more. So it seems that manufacturers are in a constant race to see who can come up with the most megapixels in their cameras or in their phones. But is that really necessary? Back in the year 2000, I actually bought this Kodak DC-280 camera, which is a 1 megapixel camera, and admittedly it did have some limitations with such a small pixel count. But this was really the dawn of the digital era, and it took a few years for the technology to really improve. So 5 years later, in 2005, I actually bought this, which is a Canon 5D, which is a full-frame 12.7 megapixel camera. So that 12.7 megapixel camera can't compete with today's 60 megapixel cameras. But it was my main camera for 15 years, and I got some really good pictures from it. So I've printed images and even framed them to hang on my wall with pictures that I've taken from that 5D. And I haven't had any issues in terms of the resolution. Admittedly, they're not huge pictures, but they're a decent size. But everyone uses cameras differently, so how many megapixels is the right amount for you? Well, of course, that depends on what you plan to do with your photos. So let me break it down for you in the next section. So many people just look at their cameras on their monitors or their computer screens. My computer monitor is an HD 1080p monitor, which is quite high resolution, although it's not quite 4K. But 1080p is actually 1920 pixels across and 1080 pictures top to bottom. So if you multiply 1920 by 1080, what you get is actually just over 2 million pixels. So what that means is that if you had a 3 megapixel camera and you displayed that on your 1080p computer monitor, that resolution would be more than enough, and anything more would be beyond the physical capabilities of the monitor to actually notice any difference. And so remember, I mentioned that some cameras these days have 60 megapixels. So viewing on a very good high definition 1080p computer monitor, that would actually be 20 times more pixels than you would actually need. And so for example, this picture here was taken on my Canon 5D 12.7 megapixel camera in Biarritz. And when it's viewed on my computer screen, it looks absolutely stunning. Okay, so where you might need a little bit more megapixels is if you're going to print your pictures. And by the way, this is something that I think people don't do enough of, printing their pictures and displaying them and enjoying the physical prints. But that's probably a topic for a different video. So print resolution is actually measured in DPI, dots per inch, rather than pixels. This is because paper and ink doesn't have pixels, they only have dots. And it's generally accepted that to print at high quality, a resolution of 300 dots per inch, or DPI, is as much as you'll ever need. Beyond that, the quality improvement isn't distinguishable by the human eye. So you can print at 600 DPI, but in general, you're not going to notice any difference compared to printing at 300 DPI. So say you wanted to print a 6x4 inch print, something around this size. Well, if you were printing at 300 DPI, then you'd need a digital image of 1800 pixels by 1200 pixels. So if you multiply 1800 by 1200, what that comes to is just around 2 million, so 2 megapixels. So in other words, for a standard 6x4 print, a 2 megapixel camera would be all that you would need, assuming you're not doing any cropping. So using the same formula, if you wanted to print, say, a 10 by 8 inch print, which is really a medium-sized print, often used by models for their portfolios, for example, if you were printing at 300 DPI, then you need a print size in terms of pixels of 3000 by 2400 pixels, which is actually 7 megapixels. So again, way below the 60 megapixels that some of the cameras today are boasting. So if you wanted an even bigger print, let's say 20 by 16 inches, which is a very decent size to hang in your home, and if you were printing at 300 DPI, then that would be an image of around 28 megapixels. So now you might be thinking, well then, so if I have a 24 megapixel camera, I won't be able to print something as large as a 20 by 16 inch print. Well, actually that's not true. And the reason is because larger prints are viewed from further away. So if we go back to that 6x4 inch print, in general, you tend to look at it from quite a close distance, something like this. But it's very unlikely that you would view a 16 by 20 inch print at the same distance. And in fact, you're more likely to be quite a few meters away, say 2 or 3 meters away when viewing that image. But the further away you get from the image, the lower the resolution that's necessary. And this is simply because when you're further away from an image, you don't require as high a resolution to enjoy that image at the same quality. As you move further away from the photo, the number of dots per inch required becomes less and less because the human eye can't notice that drop in resolution from further away. And so for that 16 by 20 inch print, instead of 300 dots per inch, you would probably get away with, say, 200 dots per inch. And at 200 dots per inch, for that size of print, you're looking at something around 12.8 megapixels. And as the prints get bigger and bigger, the number of dots per inch will reduce accordingly. And so what that means is if you have a 24 megapixel camera, you can keep printing bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it won't really matter because you'll just be lowering the dots per inch as you're printing. A good way to explain this is by looking at advertising billboards that you see out on the streets every day. These things can be very, very big. So for example, they could easily be 15 meters wide, but because they're viewed from so far away, they could be printed at 15 dpi, for example, and people looking at that billboard from the correct distance will not notice that it's a low resolution image. It's only if they went up very close to the image and looked at the billboard from, say, 50 centimeters away that they would notice that the resolution is very low. But they also wouldn't be able to see the entire billboard. They'd only be able to see part of it, and that's not the normal way of viewing a billboard. And so it's because of viewing distance that even my humble 19-year-old Canon 5D Mark I could produce images that could be printed at 16 by 20 inches at a lower DPI than 300 DPI and still look really, really good. Now when printing, there are other factors to consider. So obviously if you crop the image, then you're making it smaller and the resolution is lower. But if you're constantly cropping your images, I would say you're either using the wrong lens or the wrong technique and really need to get closer to your subject. And I think it's a really good practice to really try and get the composition correct in the camera rather than cropping later. Not to say that cropping is not allowed or is not a good idea, and certainly there will be times where you have to crop. For example, if you're doing wildlife photography and you're quite far away from the animal, it's quite common to have to crop. But for most people and most usage, cropping can be kept to a minimum. When printing, the types of paper you use will also affect the required DPI. So for example, printing on fine art paper would require a slightly higher DPI than if you were printing, say, on canvas. So while a lot of people equate the number of megapixels to the quality of the camera, and it's certainly useful to have extra megapixels in case you need it, there are actually some disadvantages with high megapixel cameras, which you may need to think about before deciding whether to buy one or not. So the raw images taken on my Leica Q2 come out at around 85 megabytes per photo. And that's a lot of disk space in terms of storage and also backup storage and cloud storage, as well as SD card storage. And after upgrading from my Fujifilm X100 to my Leica Q2, I did actually have to buy a few more extra SD cards and a few more extra hard disks, which weren't really cheap, but that's not the only disadvantage. As you add more and more pixels to a sensor, assuming the sensor isn't getting bigger, so in order to fit those pixels onto the sensor, they have to make them smaller. And in general, smaller pixels are not as good as larger pixels in terms of gathering light. So what that means is that sensors with a higher pixel density, in other words, more pixels on the sensor, tend to perform less well than sensors with fewer pixels. Without getting too technical, one good way to understand that is by trying to imagine that you are trying to capture rain in a small thimble compared to a very, very large bucket. So the very large bucket would definitely collect more rainwater than that small thimble. So sensors with smaller pixels generally perform less well in low light and are more susceptible to noise at high ISOs. And that's one reason why in general smartphones are really, really bad at taking photos in low light at nighttime, because smartphones have very, very small sensors, probably less than an inch wide. Because the file sizes are bigger, they also need more processing power. When I first got my Leica Q2, I was using an older MacBook Pro, and I did find it was really struggling in terms of downloading photos from the SD card and just in terms of processing in Lightroom. A lot of these processes took quite a long time and it can be quite frustrating. I then upgraded to the latest MacBook Pro with a faster processor in it, and I did notice that processing the Leica Q2 photos were much, much better with the faster processor. But obviously that new computer did cost a lot of extra money. So these are all things to consider before you jump in and buy a 60 megapixel camera, thinking that bigger is better. That isn't to say that a 60 megapixel camera isn't any good, it's just really about your needs, how you generally use your pictures, how you process your pictures, and what you do with them. And that will determine which camera is best for you. So we've seen how megapixels affect the size of the print you can produce, as well as the number of megapixels you need to view your screen on a high definition computer monitor. And for most people, most of the time, a high megapixel camera is not going to be that necessary. So you could save some money, and instead of buying a 60 megapixel camera, you could buy a 24 megapixel camera, and then use some of those savings to buy maybe a lens or other accessories like a flash gun or whatever it is you might need. And you'll also save money on storage in terms of SD cards, cloud storage, and also hard drives. So let me know in the comments comments your thoughts and experiences of using cameras with different levels of megapixels. And if you'd like to know more about SD cards, have a look at my video right here, where I explain what all the different symbols mean and help you to decide what SD card is right for you without overspending.